Welcome to The Value of Others by Orion Taraban, Part 4. Today I am smoking a Henry Winterman's Half Corona cigar, and I'm drinking coffee, like usual. Not entirely sure what the coffee is, but I made it with well water. We start off halfway through Chapter 2, where we left off, with the subtitle of The Passenger's Prerogatives. Before we begin, it's important to appreciate the difference between a challenge and a prerogative. To become a captain, resolving the three challenges previously described is both necessary and sufficient. There is no way around them. You cannot become a captain without resolving the challenges, but resolving the challenges is enough to make you a captain. On the other hand, passengers technically do not have to complete any of the following actions. They get to, they don't have to. And it's this discretionary optionality that makes prerogatives out of the three tasks of the passenger. And why is it useful to examine these prerogatives? For two reasons. First, just as captains display varying degrees of competence and ability, passengers do the same. It's wrong to think of passengers as passive. Like a captain, a passenger is a role that can be actively performed across a spectrum of talent and skill. There are good and bad passengers, much like there are good and bad captains. Understanding the differences between capable and incompetent passengers will help those who aspire to be the passengers of first-rate captains, and it will help captains who hope to take on top-notch passengers. Second, taking time to examine these prerogatives will significantly improve a captain's ability to attract qualified passengers and negotiate favorable terms down on the dock. Think of it like doing market research. If captains can better understand how passengers make decisions about which ships to board, then they should be able to emphasize the aspects of their captaincies most salient to passengers' decision-making processes, and this will make it much easier for captains to do business. So what are the three prerogatives of the passenger? As stated previously, they get to inspect the ship, test the captain, and examine the itinerary. Each prerogative provides the basis for one of the captain's challenges. You could think of the resolution of each of the captain's challenges as the ability to successfully prepare against each of the passenger's prerogatives. Let's look at each in turn. Down at the dock, passengers walk up and down, looking for suitable captains, even though there are more passengers than captains. Passengers today enjoy a historically unprecedented degree of optionality. A ship is moored at every slip, and captains must effectively stand out if they hope to successfully compete, and the easiest way for captains to do this is through their ships. Since different vessels can reasonably be expected to perform different functions, passengers first begin to inspect the ships on offer at a distance. Yachts are good for pleasure cruises. Ocean liners are ideal for transatlantic voyages. Submarines are perfect for clandestine rendezvous. Whatever the fuck that's meant to say or mean. For better or worse, passengers will rely heavily on the size and shape of a captain's ship in their decision to either keep walking or approach for a closer inspection. This is because passengers are always constrained by two factors: time and money. Money is the value with which passengers hope to transact their passage, and it will become more important when we discuss the negotiation process in greater detail. Time is the medium in which decisions are made. If they already have a destination in mind, passengers typically don't have the luxury of idly strolling the pier or the means of thoroughly examining every ship they pass. As a result, they tend to rely on time-saving selection heuristics in inverse proportion to their available time. The more in a hurry they are, the more cursory their inspections will be, and the more they will rely on easily recognizable proxies of seaworthiness. One of the proxies passengers most commonly utilize is the size of the crowd in front of any given ship. Captains who, for whatever reason, have already succeeded in attracting attention are more desirable than captains who haven't. This is true for two fundamental reasons. In the first place, people want what other people want. Securing something is in limited supply, and high demand is a status flex, as it communicates the securer's relative superiority with respect to some kind of transactable resource. And people like to feel superior to others, though they certainly don't like to admit it. And in the second place, it delegates due diligence to others. If passengers neither have the time nor the inclination to thoroughly examine the captains on offer, then they can reasonably assume that at least some in the crowd of passengers in front of any given captain did, and that this subgroup found a particular captain especially attractive, given the relative competition. This approach isn't foolproof, as it is subject to all kinds of faddishness and caprice, but it mostly works, which is why it has survived as a heuristic. If passengers are sufficiently interested in a captain's vessel and intrigued by the crowd standing on the dock, they will approach close enough to examine the captain proper, and on the basis of their own eyes and ears, they will begin to form judgments with respect to who this captain is. First, they will consider the captain's physical appearance. This means both the captain's dress and physique. Next, they will listen to the captain's speech. This means both the captain's words and tone. And finally, they will consider the captain's manner. This means both the captain's emotional state and behavior. On the basis of the captain's appearance, speech, and manner, passengers will begin to cultivate fantasies or expectations of what it would be like to be on board of the vessel. That said, savvy passengers know that looks can be deceiving, popularity is fickle, and expectations are not always justified. These folks won't be content to only examine the ship from the outside. They will want to inspect the inside as well. Among other things, the interior of a ship will give potential passengers a fairly good idea of the level of safety and comfort they will enjoy on board. Will they find lifeboats or water seeping through the planks? Will they sleep in a sumptuous stateroom or a hammock in the hold? And most importantly, has a place been created for them? If so, where is it? A poolside deck chair underneath an umbrella, or a seat at the helm at the captain's right hand? This interior examination will afford potential passengers a reasonable basis from which to extrapolate a vision of the voyage. Now, before we continue, let's pause here and consider the significance of what has already been said for the sexual marketplace. Allow me to make a few aspects of the analogy explicit, if they weren't already obvious. The most important thing to understand about the selection process of passengers is that a good deal of it happens before the captain is even aware of the passenger's presence. If passengers don't like the look of a captain's ship, they will keep walking. If passengers observe that no one else seems to be interested in a captain's ship, they will keep walking. And if passengers don't like what they see and hear of a captain's appearance, speech, and manner, they will keep walking. All these filters are typically applied before a captain even has the opportunity to interact with a potential passenger. And this awareness brings with it two important corollaries. First, if captains are not enjoying good optionality despite their advantageous position in the marketplace, remember, the demand for captains almost always outstrips the supply, then the problem lies somewhere in the inspection funnel, at the level of the ship, at the level of the marketing, or at the level of the personal presentation. Each of these problems has a solution. If the problem lies at the level of the ship, then captains must invest resources to make their lifestyles appear more emotionally compelling. If the problem lies at the level of the marketing, then captains must make an effort to become more visibly competent. And if the problem lies at the level of the personal presentation, then captains must attend to their fitness, their fashion, and their communication. An issue at any one of these levels will significantly reduce the number of passengers any given captain can hope to engage. And second, if several filters are applied by passengers prior to first inspection, it means that passengers who enter into discussion with any given captain are much more interested than they likely appear to be. This is important for captains to remember throughout the negotiation phase, as passengers use all kinds of tactics to secure discounts for themselves by seeming to be uninterested in what's on offer. The prerogative of passengers to inspect a captain's ship speaks to the paramount importance of lifestyle in the sexual marketplace. Captains must have something to invite passengers into, and that something is their lifestyle. If that lifestyle isn't supported with knowledge and resources, it probably won't last long. After all, no one wants to get on a boat that will fall apart in the middle of the ocean. If these components are these components are essential. So these components are essential to attracting long-term passengers. On the other hand, a lifestyle that appears fun and exciting is more useful for attracting short-term passengers. When people are looking to feel something, they might hire a speedboat for an afternoon, but they typically don't want to live on one. So the lifestyle components that captains should emphasize are fundamentally related to their relationship goals. This suggests that an important component of the courtship process should be inviting passengers on board and giving passengers the opportunity to serve in the function expected of them at sea. Unless such activities constitute regular occurrences for them, rather than, say, mini-golfing or dining at Michelin star restaurants, captains should date by inviting passengers into the pre-existing structure of their lives rather than creating an extraordinary fantasy for their dates. If anything, captains looking for long-term relationships should err on the side of being too boring. On the other hand, those looking for short-term relationships should err on the side of being too bold, as this helps to cultivate the fantasy upon which initial interaction is based. Finally, captains should waste no time in asking their passengers to serve in their intended captaincies at sea. This means, for example, that captains shouldn't wait on their passengers hand and foot in the courtship process if they actually want their passengers to cook and clean later in the relationship, just like in business. Applicants should be evaluated according to their ability to discharge the responsibilities they will be expected to perform. Now, let's say that a given captain's ship passes a given passenger's inspection. Does that mean that the passenger is ready to set sail? Not at all. It simply means that the passenger may then exercise the second prerogative, the right to test the captain. What does this mean? Well, if everyone is a good sailor when the seas are calm, how much more important must it be to determine who is a good sailor on land? However, this is precisely the task set before passengers, and anyone who's been around the dock knows it doesn't take much to pretend to be a captain. Some folks dress the part but don't know how to play it. Others own the ship but don't know how to sail it. Things are not always what they seem to be. This is why passengers have the right to test the captain before coming on board, and since they cannot directly assess a captain's sailing ability on land, passengers generally have to content themselves with evaluating a captain's character. and the surest way to do that is to arbitrarily cultivate stress in their interactions. How a captain responds to arbitrary stresses on land is a decent though imperfect proxy for how that same captain might respond to necessary stresses at sea. With respect to the sexual marketplace, this second prerogative helps explain why certain passengers can be so difficult in the courtship process. Appreciate that the marketplace includes many deceptive signals. Some people wear designer clothes in the club, but have no money in the bank. Others present highly curated images of their lives on social media, but give no or little thought to their actual lifestyles. Still, others appear confident and composed, but lose their equilibrium at the smallest frustration. Testing is how passengers attempt to differentiate the real captains from the pretenders and the charlatans. How do you treat a car on a test drive? If you're like most folks, not well. As soon as you're out of earshot of the dealership, you're probably stepping on the gas, slamming on the brakes, and whipping around corners. You'll look under the hood and kick the tires and honk the horn. In fact, if you have any sense whatsoever, you'll do everything you can to reveal any latent flaws or defects, anything that shows signs of falling apart or needing repairs, before you sign the contract. And of course, if you choose to sign, your behavior will change accordingly. No one drives a car with more care than a new owner. Passengers do the same thing before coming aboard, except the vehicle they are stressing is the captain's character. They are creating an artificial storm on land in order to predict how a captain would weather an actual squall out at sea. Perhaps passengers can stress a captain's character in a near infinite number of ways, including being flaky, disrespectful, impulsive, uninterested, dishonest, or incompetent, just to name a few. This is because, no matter the person in question, all passengers eventually will be flaky, disrespectful, impulsive, uninterested, dishonest, or incompetent at some point on a long enough timeline. This is analogous to the fact that, no matter the person in question, all drivers eventually will have to step on the gas, slam on the brakes, and whip around a corner at some point on a long enough timeline, just as drivers want to know a car's responsiveness before they need to know it. Passengers want to know a captain's reactivity before they need to. It's kind of threatening terrain. It's drizzling a tad, weighing up whether it's worth moving or not, or just sitting it through is quite light. The prudence that underlies this passenger prerogative is important for captains to keep in mind, because this testing can be both expensive and infuriating if they are not careful. Otherwise, good captains, who may have already invested considerable resources into building their boats, will find themselves with few actual passengers amid a lot of apparent optionality. Consequently, it's useful for captains to remember that testing indicates a high degree of interest. Just like few people will test drive a car they are not seriously considering buying, few passengers will take the time and trouble to test a captain they are not seriously considering engaging. And this is also why testing the captain is the second prerogative. The condition of the ship always takes priority, so the presence of testing indicates that a captain has already successfully resolved the first challenge. Now let's imagine that a given passenger has already exercised the first two prerogatives to satisfaction. That is, the ship is ship-shape and the captain is capital. Is the passenger finally ready to head out to sea? Not quite. There's just one thing left to do, namely, examine the itinerary. You would be forgiven for believing that this prerogative would be the most straightforward of the three. In most modern ports, a vessel's destination is clearly and unambiguously displayed. Cruises publish daily itineraries so that passengers know every port of call well in advance of disembarking. Exercising this prerogative is generally a simple confirmation. Is this the boat bound for Barbados? This, however, is not the kind of dock on which we find ourselves. Rather than a safe and efficient transit center, the sexual marketplace is like a shady port in the 18th century Caribbean. Pirates and buccaneers rub shoulders with soldiers and legitimate businessmen. Order and infrastructure contend with chaos and intrigue. Things are not always what they seem to be. As we'll see, this is not due, as most people believe, to the dishonesty of certain bad actors. It's an essential feature of the marketplace itself. The dock will never not be a shady port. In any case, it falls to passengers to figure out as best they can where captains are going, and where captains are really going. What does this mean for the sexual marketplace? Among other things, it means that neither captains nor passengers can rely on direct questioning to determine the nature and destination of the prospective voyage, and this is not because people are liars, although they are. It's because the more direct people are, the more transactional their relationships feel. And although all consensual relationships are transactional, most people want their intimate relationships to feel as if they weren't. This is true for both men and women and across the spectrum of relationships. A man who directly propositions a woman for sex generally enjoys as much success as a woman who directly propositions a man for a serious relationship. As we'll see, this is not due, as most people believe, to the dishonesty of certain bad actors. It's an essential feature of the marketplace. Where was I? This is true for both men and women and across the spectrum of relationships. A man who directly propositions a woman for sex generally enjoys as much success as a woman who directly propositions a man for a serious relationship. These two offers are gendered equivalents of each other, even if what's on offer might be what someone else is looking for. That someone might balk if it is emphasized too strongly or offered too forthrightly. The rules, though variable to time and place, must be observed. In practice, what this often looks like is men pretending to be interested in commitment and provision in order to get sex, and women pretending to be interested in sex in order to get commitment and resources. This is because pretending works. Leaving aside the moral or ethical implications of such a strategy, pretending to be interested in giving the other party what he or she wants is a far more effective approach to securing a relationship than simply declaring one's own interest in the transaction. A salesman a salesman who says he wants to do business for the sake of his commission will not be rewarded for his honesty. Note that pretending might not be a successful strategy for maintaining a relationship. However, a relationship must first be secured in order to be maintained. These are different problems requiring different solutions. As we'll see, the tacit agreement regarding how much sex is transacted for how much commitment and provision is an ongoing negotiation that transpires over the duration of the relationship, with the most powerful party securing a more favorable agreement. For the time being, however, it's enough to understand that stated intentions, i.e., what people say they are going to do, and revealed intentions, i.e., what people actually do, are not always the same. This is why examining the itinerary cannot be reduced to a structured interview or a written questionnaire, and why we probably wouldn't like it even if it could. Even assuming, perhaps, perfect honesty and transparency, both of which are anathema of seduction, this method could only hope to reveal where captains think they are going. If people are dishonest, and they are, then they are, first and foremost, dishonest with themselves. Even worse, asking people where they're going presumes they've given it some thought. In reality, most individuals do not have an extrapolated vision for their lives, though they will often use words to cover up this deficiency if pressed. When done correctly, examining the itinerary is a process of deducing where people are actually going through careful observation of their actions. And this is why it is essential that captains formulate an overarching purpose for their lives. It is extremely difficult to remain in alignment with a mission that has not been clearly articulated. By extrapolating that vision, captains create a standard against which their behavior can be measured, and this, in turn, makes it more likely that prospective passengers will discern the vision in captain's actions. It's also important to appreciate that, unless they're dealing with a ferry, and more on that later, passengers generally cannot expect to go exactly where they want. After all, they just show up with a little money and a desire to go somewhere. Captains, on the other hand, have invested years in the construction of their boats and the mastery of their craft. Captains and passengers are not equally invested in the endeavor, so it stands to reason that they are not equally franchised to direct its course. Ultimately, it is the duty of captains to create the itinerary, and the right of passengers to either accept or reject the itinerary, as they see fit. And just like there are false captains, there are false passengers who feign acceptance only to attempt mutinies once they've lost sight of land. More on this later. Both parties must be careful. Ultimately, that said, while passengers cannot reasonably expect to go exactly where they want, they are ultimately unlikely to get on a boat unless it seems to be headed in the general direction of where they want to go. And while captains can technically go where they please, they won't enjoy much demand for their services if they voyage where few passengers are interested in visiting. Just like in the commercial marketplace, in which products and services emerge out of an ongoing dialectic between producer and consumer, the itineraries of relationships, in practice, are created from the mutual interdependence of captain and passenger, and like consumer products, relationships are subject to larger market forces more often than we would generally care to admit. In any case, those are the three prerogatives of the passenger with respect to the sexual marketplace. If passengers, like the boat, approve of the captain and accept the itinerary, and are are they, at long last, ready to set sail? If only life were that simple. Rather, if these conditions are met, it's a signal that negotiations for the price of the passage are ready to begin in earnest. We'll examine what that process looks like in more detail in chapters 4, 5, and 6. The two-body problem. At the risk of making this chapter overlong, we have one more important consideration to address before moving on. As I previously stated, the terms captain and passenger are technically gender neutral, and I've been careful to avoid gendering the terms in the foregoing discussion. However, in practice, this is hardly the case. So let's briefly discuss the intersection of gender and role in the sexual marketplace. Historically, throughout nearly every age and in nearly every culture, men have always had/gotten to be captains, and women have always had/gotten to be passengers. I'm using this awkward construction, had/gotten, intentionally to keep the reality that both roles are associated with benefits and liabilities in the forefront of our awareness. For instance, there is no power without responsibility, and there is no safety without restriction. Most men were not kings of the earth, and most women were not chattel in bondage. This is a retconning of history. However, the last few decades have seen a tidal change in the sexual marketplace. The advance of modernity, the proliferation of certain technologies, and the influence of particular social movements have done much to liberate gender from role, at least for women. Throughout the Western world, women are supported, encouraged, and insensitized to ascend to their captaincies, to build boats, learn to sail, and plot a course. And I don't think this is inherently a bad thing. I'm generally in favor of greater freedom and optionality for the individual, and I can appreciate that, in certain corners of the world, there may be a dearth of good male captains for women to engage. Personally, I would rather try my own luck than bind my fortunes to an incompetent captain in a leaky dinghy. However, the converse has not been true for men. It has never been acceptable for young men to aspire to one day settle down with a good woman who will provide for him while he raises her children. Nor will it likely ever be. This has less to do with toxic masculinity or some unyielding machismo that prevents men from accessing their capabilities for tenderness and child rearing, as some theories purport, and much more to do with the fact that women, on the whole, generally find the prospect of providing for a grown man distasteful. Most would rather remain single than take on such a liability. Since women do not generally prioritize the suit of traits and skills that make for good house husbands in their selection processes, and since men tend to conform to women's preferences to secure sexual opportunity, the passenger role will never truly be open to men, especially since many of these preferences, though shaped by culture, are grounded in biology. This is not a complaint, just a reflection on reality. In most cases, if a man does not succeed in becoming a captain, he does not get to sail as a passenger, though, as we'll see, many captains end up as passengers on their own ships. He just sort of gets left on the dock. On the other hand, it is perfectly acceptable nowadays for women to become captains, sail as passengers, or increasingly deploy a mixed strategy, build a boat, and eventually secure passage on an even bigger ship. They are rarely left on the dock. That said, this mixed strategy often does not produce the desired outcome. However, in practice, women now have twice as many options as men do in the sexual marketplace. As might be expected, while these new circumstances have created historically unprecedented opportunities, they have also given rise to difficulties that have never before been encountered. The foremost of these difficulties with respect to the sexual marketplace is the two-body problem. If you're not familiar with the term, the two-body problem originated in academia. Let's say you're foolish enough to pursue a doctorate. Not only is this experience extremely stressful, joyless, and isolating, it will also devour a significant portion of your life. Nearly half of all liberal arts candidates, for example, do not complete their doctorates in less than 10 years. Just one of many good reasons to think very carefully about pursuing an advanced degree. There's a link, there's a source, a website, in the little notes at the bottom. And because they undergo this difficult, albeit arbitrary, crucible with only a few other individuals who are uniquely situated to understand something of their suffering, these people tend to enter into relationships with their classmates. The shared trial brings them together. It happens all the time. Now here's the thing. Eventually, these two budding scholars will graduate and enter into an insanely competitive job market. The number of new doctorates awarded every year dwarfs the number of new tenure track positions created by an order of magnitude. Degrees also often have a shelf life. If new doctorates aren't offered a tenure track position within a year or two of graduating, it's unlikely they ever will. Most will not be offered a job, and most of those who do will not enjoy much optionality. Given the gargantuan imbalance between supply and demand, new doctorates simply cannot afford to be picky if they hope to pursue a career in academia. Given these realities, what do you think are the odds that both members of the couple will be offered tenure track appointments at the same university? Functionally zero. Assuming both receive offers, and that's far from a guarantee, their placements might not be within 1,000 miles of each other, and if that occurs, given the struggle and sacrifice demanded of the doctoral process, what do you think are the odds that either person will give up his or her ambitions just to accommodate a relationship, especially considering that each person works just as hard for just as long as the other. Again, functionally zero. This is the two-body problem. It essentially asks people to choose between their careers and their relationships. It should be easy enough to understand what this has to do with the current state of the sexual marketplace. It like earning a doctorate. It can take 10 years or more to become a captain. The amount of time, energy, and money required to build a boat, learn to sail, and plot a course is considerable, to say the least. It's one of the largest investments people can make in their lifetimes, and given the struggle and sacrifice demanded of the captaincy process, what do you think are the odds that someone will give up his or her position just to accommodate a relationship? Functionally zero. Few people who become captains will ever truly be comfortable as passengers on someone else's boat, and that's how it should be. People don't pour their hearts and souls into their life missions just to walk away from them for someone else's preference or convenience. That's not the way of the captain. If it ever does happen, the offer would need to represent a substantially better opportunity than anything the captains could create for themselves, or it would need to arrive at a time when the captains were thinking of retiring from their position, and this is precisely what we see when we observe the behavior of female captains. Many of them only consider leaving their ships as they approach the end of their fertility windows, and only for a significantly better opportunity. This is the mixed strategy mentioned earlier. So why doesn't this generally work? Well, if a woman decides to follow the way of the captain, and if she resolves the challenges set out for her, she earns the right to moor her ship down at the dock and compete for the attention of passengers, like all the male captains, the men whose attention she would likely be much more interested in attracting. The male captains will probably not be among the crowd in front of her boat for a number of reasons. First, there's the two-body problem. These captains have invested considerable resources into their own ships, so they're unlikely to abandon their posts for passage on another. And this is especially true given the fact that women enjoy more optionality in the sexual marketplace. If it is socially acceptable for women to be captains or passengers, and only socially acceptable for men to be captains, and if someone has to leave the captain's quarters to accommodate the other, on the rational basis, would it be the man? And second, flouting these realities often leads to the dissolution of the relationship as a consequence of the woman's diminishing attraction. Most women are attracted to the suit of skills and traits embodied by captains: confidence, competence, courage, and capital. And a captain cannot remain a captain if he is a passenger. If she succeeds in luring a male captain off his boat, sounds like a siren, female captains can inadvertently destroy the basis of their own attraction by turning a daring leader into a devoted follower. They lose by getting what they want. So if male captains are probably not going to leave their ships to become passengers on female captains' boats, what about the other way round? As previously stated, this is a more likely outcome given women's greater marketplace optionality. However, this maneuver can also prove difficult. This is because what makes for a good captain is not what makes for a good passenger. The two roles generally constitute completely complementary skill sets. A woman who has spent 10 years or more mastering her captaincy is unlikely to have invested much time and effort into developing ideal passenger traits, and while every captain's individual preferences differ, most good captains are looking for good passengers. The suit of skills and traits a second captain would bring to the voyage is redundant at best and competitive at worst. This means that, at the end of the day, most female captains end up competing for the attention of male passengers, who might be more accurately described as the men who are left on the dock. These are generally not the kind of men with whom these women dreamed of becoming involved when they first started on the path of their captaincies. If good men are hard to find, they're even harder to find loafing around and about the dock. This is because the good ones spend most of their time out on the open seas, and since most women would prefer to remain single than provide for a grown man, an increasing number of modern women are capably sailing their boats right through their reproductive windows. According to a recent meta-analysis, 80% of childless women never intended to be. Educational attainment and a stable career were associated with childlessness in women, but not in men. Resource: Kaiser R. 2010. Remaining Childless: Causes and Consequences from a Life Course Perspective. Doctoral Dissertation. Utrecht University ResearchGate. The mixed strategy pursued by most women these days provides more freedom and optionality, but comes with additional risk and responsibility. And on some level, this is fair. People shouldn't be allowed to win more if they're not willing to stake more. There are two common objections to this assessment. The first believes that the previously described difficulties could be mitigated by making it more socially acceptable for men to be passengers. However, while this might make it easier for some women to retain their captaincies in the two-body problem, it completely disregards how female attraction operates. On some level, this social engineering scheme would only work if it also succeeded in fundamentally altering what women wanted and somehow motivated them to begin offering provision and protection to men. The second believes that these difficulties can be skirted with communication and compromise. These objections often take the form of questions like, why can't the captains take turns leading the ship? Or why don't they sail their own ships separately to the same destination? My rebuttal to these objections is that, if these were good ideas, we would see them implemented in paid enterprise. The fact is that these solutions, while not impossible, are impractical. They are inefficient, ineffective, and undermine the role of the captain. They are also expensive, as they demand that a greater share of resources be devoted to the relationship, instead of to whatever the relationship was trying to accomplish. The point is that these solutions come at a cost, and that this cost must often be paid with resources that would be better allocated elsewhere. In this chapter, I described the sexual marketplace as a dock where captains and passengers compete for the right to do business with each other. This led to a discussion of the complementary relationship between the three challenges of the captain and the three prerogatives of the passenger. I also briefly touched on the relationship between marketplace role and gender, and some of the implications of this intersectionality. That said, mastering a role is not enough to secure a relationship. All relationships, from casual hookups to lifelong partnerships, are comprised of three stages: attraction, negotiation, and maintenance. In some cases, three stages transpire over a matter of minutes. In others, decades. However, if you look carefully, these three stages are always present. In the next several chapters, we'll discuss how each of these stages operates. I'll begin by tackling that thorny and often misunderstood component of attraction: sexual marketplace value. If you'd like to further explore the topics presented in this chapter, please scan the QR code to access a curated playlist on the PsychHacks channel on YouTube. That is chapter 2 complete. Thank you for tuning in to today's video. I hope you're enjoying the book. A cigar a day keeps the doctor away. A coffee a day keeps the tiredness at bay. Don't forget to spend some time in nature today, and also read a book. Or, well, you don't need to, because you can just tune in and read it with me. I'll read the book for you. Keep seeking wisdom and knowledge. Yeah, like, comment, subscribe. Maybe send this to a mate who would benefit from the knowledge. And stay tuned. I'll finish the book. I'll keep reading and being consistent with daily uploads. And check the link in the description for my Etsy shop where I sell animal skulls and bones. It's fucking cool. Got deer with antlers, sheep from the mountains. You got a pony skeleton, got squirrels, badger, like even a cat. Peace out. Till next time.